Imagine a world where noon meant something different in every town, where a man leaving breakfast in one village could find the church bell striking a different hour an hour down the road, where a train's timetable was a quilt of local suns, beautiful, chaotic, dangerous. Then, in the hush before dawn on November 18, 1883, a network of iron and telegraph decided to stop the chaos. They cut the globe into straight lines of time, and in that silent slicing, the modern world was born. This is the story of clocks, of commerce, and of the small, stubborn human need to agree. Slow down. Listen. Time is about to change. If you enjoy the slow, curious turn of history, like, subscribe, and join History But Boring. Let's make the past feel patient. Before there were time zones, there was sun time, an honest local thing. For countless generations, people marked the day by the sun's arc, dawn, noon, dusk. In every hamlet and city, the sundial and the church bell synchronized the rhythms of work and worship. Noon meant the moment the sun reached its highest point above that particular place. It was local, intimate, and entirely sensible, until mobility and speed made it impractical. Imagine a stitched quilt of towns across the continent, each patch a slightly different shade of time. Step from one patch to the next, and the clock in your pocket, if you trusted it, would contradict the chime of the next village's church. Watchmakers sold precision in an era when precision was personal. A watch might be carefully set by a jeweler to the town clock, and people trusted that instrument so long as they didn't travel. Then the iron beasts arrived, the railways. Steam locomotives forged new connections between distant towns and cities. Where travel had taken days, it now took hours. Timetables appeared, printed schedules that promised passengers and freight a form of order. But the printed order was built on an invisible contradiction. Timetables required a common reference. How could an express train leave Boston at 9 a.m. when a small town it would pass through considered 9 a.m. to be a different moment entirely? The practical problems mounted rapidly. Telegraphs could send messages at lightning speed, faster than any train, but they couldn't make two clocks agree in two places without a shared standard. Dispatchers who coordinated trains found themselves juggling dozens of local noons. Confusion bred mistakes. One company might publish its schedule in Philadelphia time, another in Pittsburgh time. Connecting trains missed each other. Freight transferred slowly. For passengers, what should have been predictable travel turned staccato and fragile. There was a human cost. Collisions and near misses increased. Where timetables were inconsistent, trains could end up on the same track expecting different worlds. Railway managers and engineers, who had to keep a vast moving system safe and profitable, realized they needed a way to orchestrate all these disparate clocks into a single ensemble. Enter the telegraph and the watchmaker. The telegraph could transmit a precise moment. It is now exactly 12 o'clock in Greenwich, and thus synchronize clocks at distance. Railway companies had already been using telegraphic time signals to regulate local stations, but ad hoc synchronization is not the same as a systemic agreement about the meaning of 12 o'clock across geography. For a continent to move as a unit, somebody had to draw the lines and say, from here to there, the clocks will all be counted the same. The first practical force for change was commercial, the need to run trains safely and on schedule. The second was technological. With telegraphs and standardized railroad watches, the means to synchronize existed. The third, less obvious force was the intellectual movement towards standardization, engineers and thinkers who imagined a world that could be rationalized and coordinated. One such figure was Sir Sandford Fleming, a Canadian engineer who proposed a worldwide time standard in the 1970s. Fleming argued passionately that the world should be divided into 24 time zones, each one covering 15 degrees of longitude. His vision was mathematical and elegant, a grid over the globe to replace the quilt of local suns. Railroad companies were pragmatic. They did not need a global map of time immediately. They needed a workable schedule. In the United States and Canada, railroad managers, led by a gathering of railway timekeepers and executives, convened and concluded that a standardized time system was the only way forward. The choice they made on November 18, 1883, was both bold and quietly administrative. It was not a law from Congress, nor a treaty from kings, nor a manifesto of philosophers. It was a decision by the companies that operated the trains day in and day out. Railroad agents across North America adjusted their watches, printed new timetables, and set station clocks to one of 4 standardized times. On that date, railroads instituted what many called standard time, a simple division of the continent into zones. The change happened with the precision of a coordinated performance. In many towns, there was a 2-noon day. Local noon came and went, and then clocks were reset to the standardized time. For a few bewildering moments, the world had 2 truths about what hour it was. People ate their lunches at the old noon and then were instructed to reset their lives to the new clock. It is essential to understand that this railroad decision was not just about convenience, it was an act of modernity. The railroads, by aligning their timetables, bound distant communities into synchronized rhythm. Trains could now meet, pass, and connect with reliability. Commerce flowed more predictably. The telegraph and the watch together reshaped daily experience. The previous localism, where time was a feeling as much as a fact, yielded to a territorial time that could be stamped on tickets and freight bills. But change of this scale provoked resistance. People resisted the dislocation of old solar habits. Towns that had set their daily lives by the comfort of the sun were told to obey a schedule drawn by a distant corporation. Some churches and taverns grumbled. Farmers who rose and slept by dawn and dusk found a clock's authority less compelling. Yet the practical benefits, safer railroads, punctual commerce, coordinated communication, slowly, inevitably, won the day. It is tempting to treat November 18, 1883 as a single heroic event, as a clean edit in the story of progress. But real history is messy. The railroad's action answered immediate needs. It set a standard that later required legal reinforcement. The United States would not codify time zones into law until the Standard Time Act of 1918, which also introduced daylight saving time as a wartime measure. Even then, the map of time remained contested, adjusted, and subject to political negotiation. Standard time was a legal and cultural project as much as a technical one. So here you have the first layer, sun time, the quilt of local clocks, and the impetus of the railroads to stitch that quilt into a map of time. The story is full of small human decisions and large systemic forces. It's about engineers, watchmakers, telegraph operators, and station masters, about the weight of profit and the quiet authority of accuracy. It is the beginning of how we learn to live in coordinated time, a necessary prelude to industrial schedules, global commerce, and the precise temporality of our modern world. Before clocks could agree, messages had to travel faster than people. That change did not arrive with a roar. It arrived with a click. The telegraph was the first technology that truly ignored distance. A message tapped in New York could appear in Chicago almost instantly. This was not merely communication, it was a collapse of space. For the first time, events in one city could shape actions in another without delay. And time, which had once flowed gently and locally, was suddenly exposed as a problem. Railroads embraced the telegraph early. Trackside wires followed iron rails across forests, plains, and mountains. Telegraph operators worked inside small wooden stations, listening to the rhythm of dots and dashes, translating electricity into meaning. These operators soon became unofficial guardians of time. They relayed dispatches, train movements, warnings, and eventually, precise moments. Before standardized time zones, railroads tried to solve the problem in fragments. Major hubs adopted railroad time, often based on a large city like New York or Chicago. Smaller stations would reset their clocks daily using telegraph signals. At a specific moment, usually noon, a signal would be sent, a sharp, agreed-upon pulse. Station masters would stop their clocks, reset the hands, and restart them together. This was synchronization by force of habit, not law. And it worked, partially. But the system was fragile. Different railroad companies used different reference cities. One station might receive time from Boston, another from Philadelphia. Where lines intersected, confusion returned. A conductor transferring trains had to know not just geography, but which time system governed which track. Errors crept in quietly. A watch 5 minutes slow here, 3 minutes fast there, enough to cause catastrophe on a single-track line. Railroad managers knew this was unsustainable. The solution required not just technology, but trust. Everyone involved, engineers, conductors, dispatchers, station masters, had to believe in the authority of a single clock. That clock could no longer belong to a town or a church. It had to belong to the system itself. This is where the railroad watch enters the story. By the mid-19th century, pocket watches were common, but not all were equal. Many were decorative, inaccurate, or fragile. Railroads demanded something different. They needed watches that could survive vibration, temperature changes, and long hours. They needed accuracy measured in seconds, not feelings. Railroad companies began mandating strict standards. Watches had to meet specifications, minimum joule counts, temperature compensation, clear dials, bold numerals. Inspectors checked them regularly. A conductor whose watch drifted too much could be disciplined or dismissed. Timekeeping became a professional obligation. This was a cultural shift. Time was no longer personal, it was institutional. The watchmaker, once an artisan serving individuals, became a supplier to systems. Factories in the United States mass-produced precision watches designed for railroad use. Each watch was stamped, cataloged, inspected. The pocket watch became a badge of reliability, a symbol of trust in mechanical truth. But even the best watch was useless without agreement on what it was measuring. Enter the thinkers. Among them was Sir Sandford Fleming, a Canadian engineer whose missed train, caused by a timekeeping error, led him to question the entire system. Fleming proposed dividing the world into 24 equal time zones, each one 1 hour apart. His idea was radical in its simplicity. The Earth rotates once every 24 hours. Divide the globe accordingly. Let time follow geometry instead of tradition. Fleming presented his proposal tirelessly. He wrote papers, he spoke at conferences. He argued that standardized time was not merely convenient, but necessary for a modern world. His ideas spread through engineering circles, railroad boards, and scientific societies. But railroads were not philosophers, they were operators. They did not need a perfect global solution, they needed a workable continental one. By the early 1880s, railroad leaders in North America and Canada began meeting privately. They shared accident reports, they compared timetables, they listened to dispatchers and engineers. Slowly, consensus formed. The patchwork system had reached its limit. A decision was made. North America would adopt 4 standard time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Not because 4 was mathematically pure, but because 4 worked. The zones roughly followed lines of longitude, but bent where population, commerce, and politics demanded. Railroads drew the map, not astronomers. Cities mattered, routes mattered, profits mattered. And once the map existed, it had to be enforced. Telegraph networks made enforcement possible. At a precise moment on November 18, 1883, signals would be sent. Clocks would be reset. Timetables would change. Conductors would carry new schedules. The system would switch together. This was not a law. It was an agreement. And agreements are fragile things. What made it succeed was discipline. Railroad employees were trained to obey time. Dispatchers coordinated movements with new confidence. Engineers trusted that an opposing train would be where it was supposed to be, not where a local sun suggested it might be. Safety improved, efficiency increased, profits stabilized. Outside the railroad world, ordinary people noticed something subtler. The clock on the station wall no longer matched the sun precisely. Noon felt early or late depending on location. Some towns adjusted their church bells, others refused. For a time, 2 clocks hung side by side, local time and railroad time. But commerce has gravity. Stores aligned with trains, post offices followed schedules, newspapers printed standardized times. Slowly, resistance softened. People began setting their personal watches by the station clock instead of the church bell. Without violence, without votes, without speeches. Time changed because daily life followed the path of least confusion. It is important to pause here and recognize what did not happen. No single inventor created time zones. No government imposed them at first. No moment of applause marked their arrival. Instead, thousands of small actions aligned. A telegraph operator sending a signal, a conductor checking his watch, a station master resetting a clock. Together, these acts produced something larger than intention, a synchronized society. This is how modern systems often emerge, quietly, through coordination, rather than command. And yet, the story was not finished. Railroads had standardized time for themselves, but the law lagged behind. Courts, cities, and states still operated under older definitions. Disputes arose. Contracts referenced ambiguous hours. Legal clarity demanded political action. That confrontation between practical systems and formal authority will define the next phase of the story. But before we reach legislatures and laws, it's worth sitting with this moment, a moment when technology, commerce, and habit aligned just enough to bend the human experience of time.
The morning of November 18, 1883, arrived quietly.
There were no parades, no speeches, no public ceremonies announcing that time itself was about to be rearranged. Across North America, the sun rose as it always had. Farmers stepped into cold fields, shopkeepers lifted wooden shutters, telegraph operators unlocked station doors. Everything looked familiar, and yet beneath that ordinary morning lay an extraordinary agreement, one that would soon ask millions of people to accept a new answer to a question they had never doubted before. What time is it? For generations, the answer had come from the sky. Noon was when the sun stood highest. Church bells rang, shadows shortened, life aligned itself instinctively. But on this day, another authority waited patiently, the railroad timetable. Inside railway offices, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Dispatchers reviewed new schedules printed only days earlier. Conductors carried updated watches, freshly inspected. Station masters stood near their clocks, aware that at a specific moment they would stop the hands and move them deliberately to a new truth. The railroads called it the Day of Two Noons. In many towns, local noon would arrive first, as it always had. The sun would peak, bells might ring, lunch might be served. Then, sometime later, minutes or even nearly an hour, depending on location, the standardized noon would arrive. At that moment, clocks would be reset to align with the new time zone. For a brief stretch of history, two noons existed in the same place. Newspapers reported the coming change with curiosity and caution. Some editorials welcomed the order it promised. Others worried about confusion. A few mocked the idea that businessmen and engineers thought they could command the sun. But railroads were not asking permission. At precisely coordinated moments, telegraph lines came alive. Signals pulsed outward from central offices, carrying not words, but moments. Operators listened intently, fingers poised. When the signal arrived, they acted. Clocks were stopped. Hands were moved. Gears resumed turning. In Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and San Francisco, station clocks shifted almost simultaneously. In smaller towns, the change might lag by seconds or minutes, but the intention was unified. This was synchronization on a continental scale, something no civilization had ever attempted before. Passengers waiting on platforms noticed the adjustment. Some stared, some shrugged, some argued. Conductors explained patiently, railroad time. It sounded official, even if it wasn't law. People trusted trains. Trains carried mail, goods, relatives, and news. If trains obeyed this clock, perhaps they should too. In certain towns, the adjustment caused minor chaos. Court sessions opened early or late. School bells rang at unfamiliar hours. Merchants debated whether to follow local custom or railroad schedules. Churches faced awkward questions. Should Sunday services obey God's sun or the station clock? Some compromised, some resisted. In Louisville, Kentucky, city officials initially refused to adopt the new time. For a while, Louisville operated on local solar time, while surrounding rail connections used standard time. The result was confusion, missed meetings, delayed shipments, irritated travelers. Eventually, practicality prevailed. Louisville would join standard time the following year. This pattern repeated across the continent. Resistance rarely came from ideology, it came from habit. People did not object to efficiency, they objected to displacement. Time had always been intimate, tied to meals, prayers, rest. Now it felt abstract, imposed by distant rail offices and telegraph wires. Yet the benefits were immediate and undeniable. Train schedules stabilized, accidents decreased, commerce flowed more smoothly. The railroads had proven something powerful. Coordination could reshape daily life without force. What is remarkable about November 18, 1883 is not just what happened, but who made it happen. Not presidents, not congresses, not courts. It was corporations, engineers, managers, dispatchers, workers who understood that safety depended on shared understanding. The railroads acted collectively, even competitively, recognizing that time could not belong to one company alone. It had to be shared. This moment exposed a new reality of modern life. Private systems could create public standards. The public followed because the system worked. Throughout the day, newspapers published updates. Some called it the Great Time Change. Others treated it with dry humor. One paper noted that the sun did not notice the alteration. Another reassured readers that breakfast would still taste the same. But beneath the jokes was awe. To change time was to challenge something ancient. In rural areas, the impact. To understand how time zones came to look the way they do, we must first let go of a comforting illusion that the lines on a time zone map are natural. They are not. They are negotiated. They are argued over. They are bent and reshaped by power, population, commerce, and convenience. Time zones appear clean on paper. Vertical bands, equal hours, order imposed on a spinning planet. But the reality behind those lines is human, imperfect, and deeply political. The Earth rotates once every 24 hours. That physical fact invited a simple mathematical solution. Divide the globe into 24 slices, each 15 degrees of longitude wide. As the Earth turns, each slice enters daylight, then darkness, then daylight again. This is the elegant idea that fascinated scientists and engineers in the 19th century. But elegance rarely survives contact with people. Longitude itself had long been a problem. While latitude could be measured by the sun and stars, longitude required precise clocks. For centuries, sailors struggled to determine their east-west position. The development of accurate marine chronometers finally made global navigation reliable. With longitude measurable, time and geography became inseparable. Every degree of longitude corresponds to 4 minutes of time. That simple relationship haunted mapmakers. If you followed it strictly, every town 15 degrees east or west would share the same hour. Every town 1 degree apart would differ by 4 minutes. That was mathematically sound and socially impossible. Imagine telling neighboring towns they must eat lunch at visibly different moments because a line passed between them. The first global attempt to impose order came in 1884 at the International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C. Delegates from 26 nations gathered to decide something deceptively simple. Where should the prime meridian be? Where should longitude begin? Until then, many countries used their own reference points. Paris had its meridian. Rome had another. Even within nations, competing standards existed. Global commerce, navigation, and communication demanded agreement. After debate, Greenwich, England was chosen as the 0 point, not because it was morally superior, but because it was already widely used in navigation and charts. British maritime power had quietly standardized the world long before diplomats made it official. Greenwich Mean Time became the reference. But choosing a zero was only the beginning. Once a prime meridian existed, time zones could theoretically radiate outward. Yet when railroads and governments began drawing actual lines, they encountered resistance at every turn. Cities wanted convenience. Businesses wanted predictability. States wanted unity. Railroads wanted efficiency. These desires rarely aligned. In the United States, the 4 original railroad time zones, Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific, were practical compromises. They roughly followed longitude, but deviated where rail networks demanded coherence. A city with strong economic ties to another city wanted to share its time, even if geography suggested otherwise. Thus, time zones began to curve. Borders mattered. A state did not want to be split into multiple times unless absolutely necessary. Legislators feared confusion. Courts feared ambiguity. School schedules, labor laws, and public services all depended on shared hours. As a result, time zone lines often trace political boundaries rather than celestial ones. Rivers became time boundaries. State lines hardened them. Economic regions pulled them inward or pushed them outward. In some places, towns lobbied to be reassigned. They argued that their markets, newspapers, and rail connections aligned better with a neighboring zone. Time became something you could petition for. This human shaping of time was not unique to North America. Across the world, countries adopted time zones unevenly. Some embraced strict one-hour divisions. Others introduced half-hour or even quarter-hour offsets to better align daylight with daily life. These choices reflected culture as much as calculation. India, for example, adopted a single time zone despite spanning more than 30 degrees of longitude, a decision rooted in administrative unity. The result is early dawns in the east and late sunsets in the west. China made a similar choice on an even grander scale, compressing the entire country into one official time. These are not mistakes, they are values made visible. Returning to North America, the early railroad zones were not immediately recognized by law. Cities and states adopted them gradually. Some experimented, others delayed. The map of time evolved year by year, shaped by lawsuits, legislative acts, and public opinion. When Congress finally passed the Standard Time Act in 1918, it did not create something new. It legalized what had already become normal. The law recognized time zones as they were practiced, not as they were imagined by theorists. The map was formalized, but not frozen. Since then, time zone boundaries have shifted repeatedly. Counties have changed zones. States have debated daylight saving. Borders have moved not because the earth changed, but because human priorities did. This fluidity reveals an important truth. Time zones are social infrastructure. They exist to reduce friction. When friction increases, when commuters cross zones daily, when businesses suffer, when communities feel misaligned, the lines are reconsidered. Time bends quietly to human need. Yet even as zones bend, they retain authority. Once a time is assigned, it becomes invisible. People stop noticing it. Children grow up assuming that noon is a fact, not a decision. The map fades into the background. Only when crossing a border does time reveal itself again, jumping forward or falling back, reminding travelers that the hours are not natural landmarks, but agreements. Maps make this authority feel permanent. A printed time zone map suggests inevitability, straight lines, labels, colors. It looks as though time has always been this way, but every map is a snapshot of consensus at a moment in history. Change the consensus, and the map changes. What makes time zones fascinating is not their geometry, but their adaptility.
They're a quiet example of how humans manage complexity, by simplifying, standardizing, and then adjusting when reality pushes back. They show us that order is not imposed once and for all, it is maintained.
When time was standardized, it did not arrive as a universal blessing. It arrived as a quiet disturbance. For centuries, human life had followed rhythms older than clocks. The sun rose, work began, shadows shortened. Meals were taken when hunger and light aligned. Evening came and rest followed darkness. This pattern was flexible, forgiving, and deeply local. Standard time challenged that softness with precision. Not everyone welcomed the change. In cities where railroads dominated daily life, adjustment came quickly. Factories, offices, and markets already ran on schedules. Bells rang at set hours. Wages were counted by time worked. For these communities, standard time felt like an improvement, a tightening of something already familiar. But beyond the city centers, resistance took shape. Farmers were among the least persuaded. Their work depended on daylight, weather, and seasons, not station clocks. A cow did not care what hour it was labeled. Crops responded to sun and rain, not standardized minutes. To many rural families, railroad time felt artificial, useful only when dealing with outsiders. Some farmers continued to eat meals by sun time, while setting watches to railroad time only when shipping goods or meeting trains. Two temporal systems coexisted in the same household. Time became situational rather than absolute. Churches faced a similar dilemma. Religious life was traditionally organized around natural and symbolic time. Morning prayers at dawn, evening services at sunset. Bells marked sacred moments that connected worshipers to the heavens. Standard time disrupted this alignment. Clergy debated whether adjusting service times meant surrendering spiritual authority to secular systems. Some churches delayed adoption. Others complied, reasoning that community cohesion mattered more than astronomical purity. In many towns, church bells were among the last clocks to change. Schools, too, struggled. Children arrived early or late. Parents followed different clocks. Administrators had to choose between local custom and official schedules. Over time, standard time won, not through argument, but through consistency. Parents valued predictability. Teachers needed coordination. Once schools adopted standard time, families followed. Resistance also appeared in language. People spoke of fast time and slow time. They joked that railroads were stealing minutes from their lives. Editorial cartoons depicted businessmen tugging the sun by ropes. Humor softened anxiety, but the anxiety was real. At its core, the resistance was not about minutes, it was about control. Who had the authority to define the day? Before standardization, time belonged to the community. It was observed, not dictated. Now it was assigned, printed, enforced. People sensed a loss of autonomy, even if they could not articulate it fully. Yet adaptation is a powerful human trait. Gradually, people discovered advantages. Meetings became reliable. Travel became less stressful. Missed connections decreased. Businesses coordinated across distances. Newspapers printed consistent publication times. Life felt smoother, if more regimented. The very precision that felt oppressive also created new freedoms. Standard time allowed people to plan beyond their immediate surroundings.
A person could promise to meet someone hours away at a specific moment and trust that promise. This reliability expanded social and economic horizons. Even farmers adapted. While their daily labor still followed daylight, their interactions with markets increasingly relied on clocks. Grain shipments, livestock sales, and supply deliveries all depended on standardized schedules. Over time, sun time retreated into the background, used intuitively rather than officially. This blending produced a layered experience of time. People lived by the clock, but felt by the sun. The transition reshaped habits subtly. Meals shifted, bedtimes changed, workdays tightened. Punctuality became a moral expectation. Being on time signaled responsibility and respect. Lateness, once understandable, became suspect. This moralization of time marked a deeper cultural shift. Industrial society required synchronization. Factories needed workers to arrive together. Trains needed coordinated crews. Offices required shared hours. Time discipline became a social norm, enforced not just by managers, but by peers. The clock moved from wall to conscience. By the early 20th century, standard time felt natural to a generation that had never known anything else. Children grew up assuming that noon was fixed. The memory of 2 noons faded into trivia. Resistance became nostalgia. But traces remained. Expressions like working against the clock and beating the clock revealed an adversarial relationship. Time was no longer simply experienced, it was managed, controlled, spent, saved. Standard time also deepened inequality. Those with power could shape schedules. Those without had to obey them. Shift work, timed labor, and hourly wages bound workers to clocks more tightly than ever before. Timekeeping became a tool of administration and surveillance. Yet even within this structure, people found ways to reclaim softness. Leisure hours, weekends, holidays. These were buffers, socially agreed pauses that acknowledged the human need for rhythm beyond efficiency. In this way, standard time did not eliminate older rhythms, it overlaid them. The sun still rose and set, seasons still turned, but these natural cycles now coexisted with an abstract framework that allowed millions of people to act together. This coexistence is the quiet compromise at the heart of modern life. We obey the clock so that we may share the day. By the time governments formalized time zones in law, cultural adaptation was already complete. Legal recognition followed social acceptance, not the other way around. The clock had won, not through force, but through usefulness. Looking back, the resistance to standard time feels gentle, even quaint. But it reminds us that every system we take for granted once felt strange. That adaptation often begins with discomfort, and that the structures shaping our lives today were built through negotiation between habit and necessity.
Standard time did not become law because it was elegant. It became law because mistakes are unforgiving. In the decades before time zones were formalized, railroads lived with risk every day. Tracks stretched across vast distances, often as single lines where trains moving in opposite directions depended entirely on schedules and trust. A delay of minutes could place 2 locomotives on the same stretch of steel. In this world, time was not abstract, it was survival. Railroad companies kept records of accidents with a quiet dread. Investigations revealed a common thread. Human error compounded by inconsistent timekeeping. A conductor misread a schedule. A watch drifted. A station followed local time, while a dispatcher used railroad time. None of these errors were dramatic alone. Together, they were deadly. One infamous collision in Ohio in 1891 crystallized the problem. Two trains, one delayed, the other on schedule, collided head-on. The cause was traced to a stopped watch, 4 minutes slow. The engineer had trusted his timepiece. It betrayed him. Lives were lost. After incidents like this, railroads tightened internal rules. Watch inspections became more frequent. Schedules became stricter. But private discipline had limits. Railroads could regulate employees, not society. Courts, municipalities, and states still operated under conflicting definitions of time. This legal ambiguity created chaos. Imagine a contract specifying delivery by noon. Which noon? Local solar time? Railroad time? City time? Judges faced disputes where minutes meant money. In some cases, courts ruled that local time applied. In others, they deferred to standard time. Precedents conflicted. Time needed authority. As railroads proved the effectiveness of standardized time in practice, pressure mounted for governments to act, not to invent something new, but to recognize reality. The system was already in use. Law had simply fallen behind. The turning point came during World War I. War compresses priorities. Efficiency becomes survival. The United States needed to coordinate transportation, manufacturing, and labor across the country. Trains carried troops, coal, steel, food. Delays were unacceptable. Confusion over time was a weakness the nation could not afford. In 1918, Congress passed the Standard Time Act. The law did two critical things. First, it officially established time zones in the United States based on the existing railroad system. Second, it introduced daylight saving time as a wartime measure, shifting clocks forward to extend evening daylight and conserve fuel. The law did not mandate daylight saving time permanently. That would remain controversial for decades. But it did something more enduring. It made time a matter of federal authority. For the first time, the government defined the hours. This act marked a subtle but profound shift. Time was no longer just observed or agreed upon, it was regulated. The state now had a role in determining the structure of the day. Reactions were mixed. Businesses welcomed clarity. Courts appreciated consistency. Railroads gained legal backing for their schedules. But private citizens resented daylight saving time. Farmers complained loudly, arguing that changing clocks did not change the sun. Cows were not fooled. Crops did not grow faster. The burden fell unevenly. After the war, daylight saving time was repealed, reinstated, repealed again. Time became a political issue. States adopted their own rules. Confusion returned in new forms. But standard time zones endured. Once fixed in law, they became infrastructure like roads or borders, invisible most days, essential always. The law also empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to adjust time zone boundaries as needed. This flexibility acknowledged reality. Time zones are tools, not truths. As transportation patterns changed, boundaries could change too. Throughout the 20th century, counties petitioned to move zones. Arguments were practical: school schedules, television broadcasts, commuter patterns. Time became something communities could negotiate with the state. This process revealed an enduring tension: uniformity versus local preference. The law favored uniformity for the sake of coordination. Communities favored alignment with daily life. The resulting map was a compromise, updated periodically, quietly. Beyond the United States, similar stories unfolded.
Countries formalized time zones through legislation, often after decades of informal use. In some cases, governments imposed dramatic changes overnight. In others, adoption was gradual. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. Technology creates a standard, society adopts it, law codifies it. Rarely the other way around. By mid-century, standardized time had become so normal that its legal origins faded from memory. Children learned to read clocks without knowing they were political instruments. Schedules filled calendars. Deadlines ruled lives. The accidents that once forced reform became rare enough to forget, but the legacy remained. Modern safety systems, aviation, shipping, digital networks, all depend on precise timekeeping. Atomic clocks now define the second. Satellites synchronize signals across continents. Errors measured in microseconds can cause failures. The railroad watch has evolved into a global timing network. And yet, the human dimension persists. Despite laws and standards, people still experience time unevenly. Shift workers feel nights stretch. Commuters feel mornings compress. Cultures interpret punctuality differently. The law defines the clock, but not the feeling. This gap between regulation and experience is where tension lives. Standard time solved a technical problem, coordination. It did not solve the existential one, how humans inhabit time. That question remains open. Still, it is worth pausing to recognize what regulation achieved. It reduced accidents. It clarified contracts. It allowed millions of people to act together without constant negotiation. It transformed chaos into background order. The cost was subtle. Time became less flexible, more rigid, more demanding. The clock gained authority not just over trains, but over lives. Law gave that authority permanence. When you check the time today, you are consulting the result of collisions, lawsuits, wars, and debates. You are inheriting a compromise hammered out between safety and autonomy, efficiency and habit.
Once time was standardized on land, it refused to stay there. Railroads had proven that shared time could tame complexity across continents. But the 19th century was not just an age of iron rails. It was an age of oceans crossed by steamships, of cables laid across seabeds, and of empires stitched together by communication. For standard time to truly succeed, it had to travel beyond borders. The sea was the first test. For centuries, sailors had navigated using local solar time at their position and a reference time carried aboard in the form of a chronometer. This comparison revealed longitude. It was a delicate practice, demanding precision and trust in mechanical devices. By the late 19th century, marine chronometers had become reliable, but coordination between ports remained inconsistent. Ports operated on local time. Harbors posted tide tables based on local noon. Shipping schedules had to account for time shifts at every destination. The expansion of global trade intensified the problem. Steamships ran on tight schedules. Cargo transfers depended on timing. Delays were costly. As standard time zones spread across continents, ports began aligning their clocks with national standards. Greenwich Mean Time emerged as a reference for navigation and scheduling. Ships synchronized chronometers before departure and adjusted logs systematically as they crossed zones. This did not eliminate complexity, but it made it manageable. The telegraph amplified this transformation. The laying of undersea telegraph cables in the mid-19th century shrank the world further. Messages that once took weeks by ship now crossed oceans in minutes. Financial markets reacted instantly to news from abroad. Diplomacy accelerated. So did the need for synchronized time. Stock exchanges relied on precise opening and closing times. News agencies time-stamped dispatches. Governments coordinated responses across time zones. Without standardization, confusion would have been constant. Telegraph networks became arteries of time. Signals transmitted not just information, but moments. Greenwich time pulses synchronized clocks in colonial offices, shipping companies, and observatories around the world. Local time persisted in daily life, but official time increasingly followed global standards. This duality, local experience and global coordination, defined the era. As empires managed territory spanning thousands of miles, time became a tool of administration. Colonial governments often imposed standard time to streamline governance. Railways, postal services, and military operations demanded uniformity. Time zones were drawn not only by geography, but by authority. This imposition sometimes clashed with local customs. In many regions, indigenous timekeeping traditions persisted alongside official clocks. The result was layered temporality. People living in one rhythm while the state operated in another. Aviation intensified these pressures dramatically. Early aviation was experimental and slow, but it pointed toward a future where time would matter even more. Flights crossed multiple zones in hours. Weather forecasting required synchronized data. Navigation demanded precise timing. As commercial aviation expanded in the 20th century, standardized time became essential. Flight schedules depended on it. Air traffic control required exact coordination. Pilots used universal reference times to avoid confusion. This led to the widespread adoption of Coordinated Universal Time, UTC, a successor to Greenwich Mean Time. UTC provided a single reference for global operations, independent of local time zones. It became the backbone of aviation, shipping, and eventually digital networks. Time had become infrastructure. The expansion of global time standards also influenced daily life. International travel exposed people to time shifts more frequently. Jet lag entered vocabulary, a physiological reminder that bodies lag behind clocks. Time was now something one could cross. Globalization turned time into a negotiable space. Businesses scheduled meetings across continents. Television broadcasts spanned zones. Live events were experienced simultaneously by audiences separated by oceans. Shared moments became global phenomena. Yet this synchronization was selective. Not everyone lived in global time.
By the time
Many
standard
communities
time
remained
had gone
anchored
global,
to local rhythms.
It carried an appearance
Agriculture,
of certainty.
religious practice, and
Maps showed colored bands. Clocks ticked in neat hours. It seemed as though time had finally been disciplined into order. But if you look closely, the edges tell a different story. Time zones are full of exceptions. Some of these exceptions are small, a half hour here, 45 minutes there. Others are political, cultural, even emotional. Together, they reveal something essential. Standard time is not a law of nature. It is a tool shaped by human choice. Let us begin with the most curious feature, the half-hour time zones. If the world followed pure geometry, every time zone would differ by exactly 1 hour. Yet several regions refused this simplicity. India chose a time offset of 5 hours and 30 minutes ahead of Greenwich. Sri Lanka followed the same. Iran adopted a half-hour offset. Australia created multiple half-hour zones across its vast interior. Why? Because local life mattered. In India, A single time zone already stretched the sun awkwardly across the country. Choosing a half-hour offset was a compromise, a middle point that balanced east and west, administration and daylight. It was not perfect, but it felt fair. Time here was negotiated, not imposed. Then there are the 45-minute zones, rarer still. Nepal stands 15 minutes ahead of India, a symbolic assertion of independence as much as a practical choice. The difference is small but meaningful. Time becomes a statement. Even within countries, oddities persist. Some regions change time while neighbors do not. Some observe daylight saving time, others refuse. In the United States, Arizona largely rejects daylight saving time, while the Navajo Nation within Arizona observes it. Drive a short distance and time shifts, not because the sun does, but because identity does. These quirks confuse travelers and delight historians. They remind us that time zones are not just technical solutions, they are expressions of governance and culture. Borders play a powerful role here. A country often wants a single official time to reinforce unity, even if geography argues otherwise. China is the most striking example. Despite spanning what would naturally be 5 time zones, the entire country follows one official time, Beijing time. This decision simplifies administration and reinforces central authority, but creates strange daily rhythms in the western regions, where sunrise comes late and sunsets stretch deep into the evening. People adapt. Shops open later. Life bends. This bending reveals something important. Humans adapt to time more easily than time adapts to humans. Yet sometimes humans push back. Communities have petitioned to change time zones because of television schedules, school safety, or economic ties. Counties in the United States have switched zones to align with neighboring cities. Islands have changed time to attract tourism or ease trade. Time, once established, still moves. Even daylight saving time itself is an oddity, a seasonal manipulation layered on top of time zones. It has been adopted, repealed, reinstated, modified, and debated endlessly. Its logic, to shift waking hours closer to daylight, sounds simple, yet its effects are uneven. Some benefit, others disruption. The debate over daylight saving shows that time is never purely neutral. It favors some routines over others. What all these exceptions share is humanity. They exist because people live in places, not on maps, because societies value cohesion, identity, convenience, and habit, because no system, however elegant, can perfectly fit the messiness of lived experience. Standard time promised order. Exceptions restore flexibility. Together, they form a balance. We often imagine modern life as rigidly scheduled, but the truth is more nuanced. Time is standardized enough to allow coordination, yet flexible enough to allow difference. That flexibility is why the system endures. If time were too strict, it would fracture. If it were too loose, it would collapse. The oddities are not failures, they are pressure valves. They allow people to feel that time still belongs to them, at least a little. When you cross a border and adjust your watch by half an hour, you are encountering a decision made decades ago by people balancing light, labor, and identity. You are stepping into a compromise, frozen into clocks. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of odd time. The world runs not on perfect systems, but on good enough agreements, revised when necessary, tolerated when strange.
By the time Standard Time had settled into maps and laws, its most profound impact was no longer on trains or ships. It was on people. Not on where they traveled,
but on how they lived. Before standardized time, work followed tasks more than hours. A farmer worked until the field was finished. An artisan worked until light failed. The day expanded or contracted with seasons. Time was elastic, shaped by need and nature. The clock changed this relationship. As factories spread in the 19th and early 20th centuries, work began to obey hours rather than outcomes. Bells rang to signal shifts. Whistles marked beginnings and endings. Wages were calculated by time spent, not effort expended. Standard time made this system possible. Without synchronized clocks, collective labor would fracture. Time became measurable, and then it became valuable. The phrase "time is money" moved from metaphor to reality. Minutes lost were wages lost. Punctuality transformed from courtesy into obligation. Arriving late was no longer merely inconvenient, it was a moral failure. This moral weight altered behavior. People learned to watch clocks closely. Schedules filled calendars. Daily life was divided into blocks: work, commute, meals, rest. The clock migrated from tower to wall to wrist. Eventually, it entered the pocket, then the phone. Time followed people everywhere. This constant awareness reshaped the mind. Psychologists later noted how clock-regulated life increased anxiety and urgency. The future felt closer. Deadlines loomed. Leisure became something to schedule rather than drift into. Yet standard time also created new freedoms. Predictable hours allowed people to coordinate socially. Shared evenings enabled entertainment, clubs, and civic life. Weekends emerged as collective pauses, socially agreed breaks from productivity. These breaks only worked because time was standardized. Everyone stopped together. Rest became synchronized. This synchronization shaped identity. People defined themselves by schedules: 9-to-5 workers, night shift employees, early risers. Time structured social categories. The workplace was not the only domain affected. Education adopted standardized schedules. Children learned discipline through bells and timetables. The school day mirrored factory rhythms, preparing students for clock-based adulthood. Time became a teacher. Even language changed. People spoke of saving time, wasting time, killing time. Time was treated as an object to manage. Life felt like a sequence of appointments rather than a flow. Yet beneath this structure, older rhythms persisted. Bodies resisted strict schedules. Fatigue, hunger, and attention followed biological cycles. This mismatch created tension. Shift work disoriented sleep. Jet lag disoriented travelers. The clock said one thing, the body felt another. Modern life lives inside this tension. Standard time enabled complexity, cities, global markets, digital communication, but it also compressed experience. Moments felt scarce, slowness felt inefficient. In response, people invented counter-rhythms, vacations, sabbaticals, mindfulness, slow movements in food and living. These were attempts to reclaim time as experience rather than a resource. They did not reject standard time, but they softened its grip. The modern mind oscillates between urgency and longing. We rush through hours, then seek to escape them. This is not failure, it is adaptation. Standard time gave humanity the ability to act together at scale. It also demanded new coping mechanisms. The balance is ongoing. Today, digital technologies have intensified this relationship. Notifications fracture attention. Global connectivity erases temporal boundaries. Work spills into nights. Time zones matter less, yet more. We are always on. Yet the foundation remains the same system born of railroads and telegraphs. Every calendar alert, every meeting reminder, every countdown inherits the logic of standardized time. Understanding this history does not free us from the clock, but it does make the clock less invisible. It reminds us that the pressure we feel is not natural law. It is a structure, useful, powerful, and adjustable. And perhaps that awareness itself is a form of rest.
At the end of this long story, it is worth asking a simple question. If time zones solved so many problems, safety, coordination, global connection, why does time still feel strange? The answer lies in how this system was born. Time zones were not created to make life meaningful. They were created to make life work. Before the 19th century, time belonged to places. Each town lived under its own sky. Noon was local, personal, and unquestioned. This worked because life moved slowly. Distance mattered. Most people rarely traveled far from home. Time did not need to agree beyond the horizon. Then, speed arrived. Railroads shattered distance. Telegraphs collapsed delay. Suddenly, disagreement about time became dangerous. Trains collided. Schedules failed. Commerce stumbled. The old relationship between the sun and the clock could no longer support the new world. So humans did something radical. They agreed. Railroad companies synchronized clocks not because it felt natural, but because it saved lives and money. Engineers, watchmakers, telegraph operators, and station masters built a practical system of shared hours. On November 18, 1883, much of North America changed time without a single law being passed. That moment revealed a modern truth. Systems can reshape reality quietly. Governments followed later. Laws formalized what practice had already normalized. Time zones entered legislation. Daylight saving appeared, disappeared, and returned. Borders bent time. Politics shaped hours. The clock gained authority. Then time went global. Ships used standardized reference times. Telegraph cables spread synchronization across oceans. Aviation demanded universal coordination. Greenwich became a reference. Atomic clocks refined precision. Time became infrastructure, as essential as electricity or roads. And yet, everywhere this system spread, it met resistance. Farmers trusted daylight. Churches hesitated. Communities complained. Cultures adapted unevenly. Exceptions appeared. Half-hour zones, single-time countries, regions that refused seasonal clock changes. These were not failures. They were reminders that time is lived, not just measured. Standard time succeeded because it allowed flexibility at the edges. Over time, the clock reshaped work. Labor became hourly. Punctuality became moral. Education trained children to obey schedules. Leisure was confined to weekends and holidays. The modern mind learned urgency. Time became something to manage. But humans never fully surrendered to the clock. Bodies resisted, minds tired. Societies invented pauses, vacations, weekends, slow moments. These were acts of balance. This is why time still feels strange. We live inside a system designed for coordination, not comfort. It aligns millions of people,
but it does not align perfectly with biology or emotion. The sun still rises and sets, seasons still change, but our lives follow abstract hours drawn on maps and maintained by machines. We feel the tension because we are meant to. That tension is the price of connection. Every time you check your phone, schedule a meeting, catch a flight, or watch a live event across the world, you are inheriting a compromise between nature and necessity. Time zones are not lies, they are promises. Promises that if we all agree on the hour, we can move together, trade together, communicate together, rest together. They remind us that much of modern life depends on invisible cooperation, on standards we rarely notice until they fail. Understanding this history does not demand that we reject the clock. It invites us to see it clearly. Time is not just ticking seconds. It is human coordination frozen into habit. And once you see that, the strangeness makes sense. Because we are not machines. We are creatures who remember the sun even while living by schedules. If you've stayed with this story from local noon to global time, thank you for slowing down. If this gentle, unhurried history helped you think or rest, please like and subscribe to History But Boring. We believe the past doesn't need to rush, and neither do you.